Hey gamers, Maniac here with GameAccess.net doing my most recent podcast. It's been a bit of a while since the last time we've done a podcast, and my apologies for that. I have been planning future podcasts, and I do have some more podcast ideas in the pipeline. I kind of want to hear your ideas on future podcast ideas, but other than that, I do have a couple of ideas for future game properties that I'd like to talk about. For those of you who don't know what our podcast format is, it basically works like this. I spend a certain amount of time talking about a particular video game or video game franchise. My experiences with it, if the game is out, which it typically is, I'll talk about the game itself, the history behind the game, and that sort of thing, basically. This is unscripted. This is live, as well as live as can be. And no holds will be barred in this case for our discussion. And what better way to describe no holds barred on basically what could be considered one of gaming's first major mess ups. Probably one of the biggest disappointments in gaming history. And of course I'm talking about John Romero's Daikatana. Daikatana is a game that was in development. It was directed by John Romero. It was developed by Ironstorm Dallas. And it is, by all intents and purposes, one of the biggest jokes of the PC gaming industry. And has been for going on 15 years now. Now, the thing that everybody probably remembers about John Romero is the factor that he was one of the best level designers for id Software. And id Software basically invented the first-person shooter on the PC. So this guy had already put a major, put himself out there as a major creative genius, as well as a very accomplished programmer and designer. He wasn't a super technical individual, but he certainly was competent enough to know what technology to try to use or how to make the best out of the technology that he's got in his hands, basically. That was what one of his strengths was. He could take his partner, or one of his partners, John Carmack's designs and technology and basically push it to its absolute limit. And when they had a bit of a falling out shortly before Quake 2 came out, then Romero decided he was going to strike it out on his own. He took another veteran of id Software with him that had been fired earlier, Tom Hall, because he was a really good designer. And his intention was to create a video game studio where, as his philosophy was, design is law, where everything was about game design, where design was the most important thing that you'd have. He called up another guy who he was impressed by, Warren Spector, and he says, I think you should work for me as well. He got in advance some money from a company called Eidos, which was banking on the success of a property that they had called Tomb Raider. They had millions of dollars in sales on Tomb Raider's franchise, and they were willing to give some bank to John Romero for developing, for basically starting his own studio and designing some new games that they would publish that he was promising would be the greatest games ever made. And Ironstorm was born. Well, here was the thing. John Romero, by this point, had gotten a bit of drunk on his own popularity. He was taking and calling himself God. And there is some argument that his references could have been reference to the fact that he was one of the original game gods, basically. I don't consider him part of those game gods anymore, but he may have been the origin of the term game god, which is, the most elite of elite game developers, basically. So Romero started working on a new game, which he intended to use id Software's technology, the Quake engine, and he was going to make the most detailed, awesome, epic game that he could come up with. The title for the game, Daikatana, came from a Dungeons and Dragons pen and paper game session that he and many of his peers from id Software used to actually play in between game design sessions. They would play Dungeons and Dragons, and John Romero was one of the was a player. John Carmack was the dungeon master, and it all came to a head when basically, let's face it, John Romero got sloppy. And in the D&D session, and from what has been written, they had acquired a very powerful book of spells during a quest. A demon presented itself to Romero's character and said, I would be willing to trade you that book for something, if you'd be willing to accept it. And Romero's like, well, what would you possibly offer me for this book? And he says, I'll give you the Daikatana. The Daikatana, being literally meaning big sword, was the most powerful sword in Carmack's D&D game. Romero agreed, and the demon / whatever used the book for unspeakable evil that the game characters were not able to overcome even with the Daikatana. And the game basically ended. All the characters were killed. The universe was overrun with demons. Several years of a D&D session was now over. The game was over. Everybody died. You could basically argue that this is basically a whole analogy for what happens when you shoot too high and miss. I don't think that irony was lost on John Romero. But his major game that he was going to be developing under Ion Storm was going to be that game, was going to be Daikatana. And the great thing about it was that he was, let's be honest, he was going to try to do something new. By this point, first-person shooters, everybody was doing their own first-person shooter clones at this point. By the time id popularized them, there were people that were doing them left and right, basically. This was before Half-Life had come out, and I would probably argue that Half-Life probably succeeded where John Romero had failed. But I think that it was what Half-Life had achieved was kind of what John Romero was going for. He wanted to create a first-person shooter where you not only could have a long epic story, you could have different time periods. You could have a game that was all tied into a cohesive story that was more than just one paragraph or one page that you would look up in a help file or something. He wanted something that was fully integrated into the gameplay, which was a bit unusual in around 1997, so I'll give him that. I mean, even Duke Nukem 3D, for example, story was basically just a paragraph. And it didn't even, it wasn't even there when you first started the game. If you want to know the story when you're finally, thrust into the action for Duke Nukem 3D, then basically you had to just look up the help file. I remember when I first started playing Duke Nukem 3D, I was told, oh, this game is great, you got to play it. And I booted it up, and I'm like, what the heck is going on? And I'm like looking into the help file, like, oh, so that's the story. Some alien shot down his ride. That's all it was. So there was that. I think John Romero wanted to basically do this. And to kind of give it a little bit of another thing that would basically see something new, he wanted to have the game integrate artificial intelligence controlled sidekicks. 2 artificial controlled sidekicks that would help you or help assist you during the battles and stuff like that. So you'd basically have these guys that would always be helping you out, these 2 bots that would, assist you, and that you'd be able to direct them with things like commands and stuff like that, but you'd also, they'd also protect you if they needed to. And he had all these grand ideas. And let's be honest, this was unusual. We really didn't see stuff like this. And, well, let's face it, once again, with the shoot too high or miss mentality, John Romero likely very inspired by what was going on with land culture at the time, where you had trash talk. Basically put up an advertisement that said, John Romero is about to make you his bitch. And the subtitle was, Suck It Down. And it was a big advertisement for Daikatana, which was a game that they were expecting to be able to finish quite quickly. I mean, most of the work that John Romero had imagined going into the development of a game was basically in the creation of the game engine. He figured that if they could simply license a game engine, add the technology that they needed, build new maps and new characters, they would be able to basically create a game in about a year. And even if there were delays, it would only be in the span of about a couple of months, basically. So he was aiming, if I remember correctly, for a late 1997 release. Well, instead of being excited about this prospect of John Romero coming out with a brand new title that's going to be so epic it's going to make you his bitch, a lot of people were just virulently angry at the pretentiousness of John Romero for making these grand assertions with so little to show for it, basically. They were willing, I think they were willing to give John Romero a shot because, like I said, he had the background. He did have the skills, but the thing was, you have to put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to make a claim like that, you have to have something. Nowadays, I don't think any game developer would dare make any announcement without at least some game footage to back it up. They would, nowadays, probably ever since like Halo 2's announcement, it's become a tradition that you don't announce a game, at least not do a major announcement of a game, with the intention to sell it, until probably the game is just about ready. Number one. And number two, you would usually have footage at the very, screenshots at the very least, images, something. But back then, games were games were announced just as they were starting. People would announce game projects as they were just starting them, even in a lot of cases with nothing to show for it. The problem with that was that, yeah, you would get people excited for the game, but whereas it used to take a year and a half to make a game, in some cases it would take much longer. And publishers and studios, didn't quite get wise as to the fact that people don't like waiting 4 or 5 years for a game title. They don't like being strung around, waiting. In most cases, if you wait that long, then the game, people aren't going to care when the game finally does come out, if in fact it comes out at all. And if you don't believe me, just ask Duke Nukem Forever's developers. People waited 12 years for that title. When it finally came out, nobody cared anymore, for the most part. And the people who did play it were so caught up in the fact of how much they hated the game before they even started playing it. The reviewers, I would say, particularly. Reviewers really hated that game. They just couldn't see. I enjoyed it, but that's not, that's another discussion for another day. Maybe I'll do a Duke Nukem podcast in the future, which I don't think I've done. So that's the danger about this. Well, of course, John Romero, he made the announcement, and, well, the rest is history, basically. The game was expected to come out early, shortly around this, a couple of months after that, an ad. It wasn't able to make the release. The reason why was because when the game was being shown at E3 that year, there was another game that was also being shown at E3. And that was, of course, Quake 2 by id Software. The graphics and the effects that Quake 2's engine had were so far advanced as to what John Romero was offering with his game, he knew that he had to switch the game engines to something else just to be able to compete. Now, I know what you're probably saying, Video games nowadays look great, but to be perfectly honest, back in that time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, PC technology was advancing exponentially year to year. Just exponentially. The problem with that was if you made a game, 6 months later there would be another game out there that would be able to just push it. If you were developing a title, there was always the incentive to keep improving your visuals, so that when you did release, you would be better looking than the other titles that were out there, at least when they hit the market. Some games couldn't do that, some games tried. This meant a lot of delays in a lot of cases, and in some cases a delay could mean the end of your title. A lot of publishers were very much against delaying titles for that reason. Even if the game was buggy, they'd still release it on the PC, hoping that, well, it looks good enough as it is, we'll patch it later. Well, we all know how that turned out. Now, at E3, Daikatana was being shown, and alongside Daikatana, id Software was also showing off what they were currently working on, which was a game called Quake 2. In comparison to Daikatana's showing, Quake 2 was basically the belle of the ball, if you will. Everybody was wowed, including John Romero, about the awesome technology that John Carmack was able to provide for this next game in the Quake series. And he knew that the graphics and the effects that this new engine was capable of would simply blow Daikatana's completely out of the water. There was just no comparison. And Romero left E3 thinking if it doesn't try to use the Quake 2 engine, if they don't end up using the Quake 2 engine, they're going to be sunk. Now, the upside of that was that Ion Storm's contract with id Software was such that if id Software had any new graphics engines available, they would be able to use those as well. It was no big deal. The downside of that was it meant that they would have to port over all of the stuff that they had worked on to the new graphics engine, essentially adding more time in development. Now, Romero had assumed that would probably take maybe about 3 to 6 more months to basically port over their systems, whether it be their levels or their code or whatever, basically, to the new engine. That's basically, they wouldn't need to do that much, basically. A couple of months lost would be at most. And that's what he told the publishers when he says, I want to switch over. The publisher was very much against them switching over to the Quake 2 engine because it meant more development time. But Romero assured them that this would help make an even better game. So the extra time would be worth it. John got the code, and straight from id Software, he started looking over it, and he's like, okay, we're going to get ready for like 3 months of delay, but it will work. And he looked at the code, and even though the code was amazing, it was not compatible. That was the key. The Quake 2 engine, even though it was id Software's baby, just like the previous engine was, it had gone in a completely different way. It wasn't, you can't just change a couple of variables here or there or take some files and move them over to a new format. They would basically have to restart from scratch when he saw this code, because it didn't advance well. It was not, you couldn't port this in. You would literally have to restart the project from scratch. All the work they had done, with the exception of the design documents, would basically have to be redone. The game effectively had to restart. He told the publishers this code is jacked, and they lost even more time. Now, I don't want to spend this whole podcast talking about the history of, Daikatana's development. If you really want to know the entire story from start to finish, I would recommend checking out, if you can still find it, I don't know if it's still in print, David Kushner's book, Masters of Doom, which is an amazingly epic book. I believe Kushner has since written a book about the development of Grand Theft Auto series, which I believe is called Jacked, which I unfortunately have not read. But so my point is that there are books and there is material out there that you can check out about this. I would totally recommend, if you can find a copy of Masters of Doom, to do so and read it, because it is an incredible, just incredible read about the entire game industry, up from probably around its beginnings to about the 2004 or so when the book published. And that was like the one positive memory I have of my old school, was that the book wasn't supposed to be published for at least another couple of weeks, and I had asked for a copy just on pre-order, because at my university you could pre-order books and get them, or order them, and then they would just simply ship them to you, and you could pay for them when they arrived, which in 2003 was kind of a novel thing, basically. So I remember one day, it was like towards, I think it was the end of the school year, my freshman year of college, in a school that I was not planning on sticking around in. And I went to the reference desk and simply said, look, there's a book that's coming out. It's called Masters of Doom. And if you could please, it's not out yet, so don't worry about it. But if it does come out, could you notify me or hold a copy for me, basically? And they ran it through the computer and they said, we've got copies on the shelves right now. And I said, what? Yeah, we've got copies on the shelves right now. You can just go and pick one up. Now, as far as I knew the book wasn't supposed to be out for another 2 weeks. And, this was back before, they had that thing about, no, it has to be everywhere worldwide, basically, before we'll put it on shelves. And so I picked it up. I said, so I can just go to the shelf. I went to the shelf. I picked it up. I read it. By that point, that was like towards the end of the school year, and summer was starting. I worked that summer. But basically between working, in my off breaks of working, because I was working and I had a lot of downtime, because it was, I was basically living at work, basically. I was working at University of Connecticut, so I was doing, RAing and stuff like that. So in my downtime, basically, I was reading Masters of Doom. That was a good summer. That was a really good summer. And I never went back to that school. Well, University of Connecticut, I continued to work there every summer. I enjoyed that work very much. But I never went back to that university in California that shall not be named. And I think I'm all the better for it. So anyways, moving on. That was kind of like a bit of my personal stories with that, but at least that's where I got my information from. As for, my immediate exposure to Daikatana, or at least my first exposures to it personally, probably would have been from reading magazines PC Gamer. Like I said, I had a subscription to PC Gamer probably starting around 1997, 1998 or so. I actually got the subscription when I picked up a copy of Aliens vs. Predator on the PC. And so I got a subscription, and my books started coming in. And 1 month, and I can't remember exactly when this is. I think it might have been sometime late 1999 or so. PC Gamer did one of their best issues ever. And still to this day, I don't think they ever outdid it. Where they basically had a magazine. Now, PC Gamer would include with every issue a disc. It was a data disc which would have demos on it and stuff like that, basically. And it was cool for if you were a person like me who was still on a 28.8 BPS modem. Well, I had a 56K modem, but I could still only get connection speeds about 28.8, 3600 if I was lucky. Thank you for that, my former ISP. And so what basically happened was that on this disc, on this particular disc, I think it was sometime in 1999, they included with it full versions, not trial versions, full versions legally, of several amazing old school DOS games. If I remember correctly about what was on that disc, it had the original Ultima. It had Ultima Underworld, although you could not get it to run. Ultima 1 ran just fine, though. The original Wing Commander. I can't remember what else was on that disc. It was just a whole bunch of just amazing games. And I don't think they ever... I don't know why they never did anything like that again. I really don't. The closest I can remember them ever even trying to do something like that again was on a 2001 PC Gamer of... I think it was... I can't even remember what it was exactly. I think it was like... it was a 2001 PC Gamer issue where they were... The cover was Max Payne. Max Payne was about 3 months away from getting released. And they did a preview on Max Payne, and they included on that disc a full copy of Duke Nukem 3D version 1.3. It didn't include the Atomic Pack, but it did include, the first 3 episodes, fully legal, which was really nice. But that aside, I can't really, for the life of me, think of anything else, basically, where that kind of thing happened. And included on the disc, along with some of the other content that was on the disc, was a demo for Daikatana, which I thought was pretty awesome. Now, by that point, I think that a lot of people were pretty much expecting this game to be a flop. The demo did not really change most people's opinions. The Daikatana demo, most people argue, it had the first couple of levels in there. It did not include the opening cutscene. But the demo had at least the first couple of levels, which were basically shooting frogs. It had 3 missions in it. One from each of the first 3 time periods. And so it had the first... I can't remember exactly what it had, which particular missions it had. It did not have the last time period. They did that intentionally. But it was to kind of show, this is what the first time period would look like, this is what the second would look like, and this is what the third would look like. I was kind of hoping for a bit more, but that was what it included. Most people stopped in the first mission. Most people started playing the first mission. They were like, this game is terrible. Shooting all these frogs, these robot frogs, looks terrible. And of course, the save points and you can only save from save spheres, but these you have to have save gems in order. Are you kidding me? So people did not like it very much. But there was at least one guy. I think it was the Vitterman. I think Vitterman, who was working for PC Gamer at the time, they called him the Veed, if I remember this correctly, thought it had some potential. But, this was still, the game wasn't out yet. Still be a couple of months before the full version would come out. So, again, I was kind of, on the fence about it. I didn't know really what to think. Moving on, at least, I think this was probably summer 2000. I can't remember exactly what month it was. It might have been May, might have been June. PC Gamer released a new issue, and Diablo 2 was on the cover, and it was a review of Diablo 2, and these guys were absolutely, totally, and utterly loving this game. Just Diablo 2 is the greatest game ever. Blizzard is awesome. We love this game. We played it like crazy. They devoted a good couple of pages in the middle of the magazine to Diablo 2. And, some would argue Diablo 2 still stands up to this day, so that's fine. You can say it's a great game. It's fine. So, moving on. In that same issue was a review of Daikatana. It was not a positive one. In fact, if I remember correctly, and I don't remember who wrote this article, but if I remember the exact words that he used to open that review, it was something along the lines of, I remembered reading that John Romero was about to make you his bitch, and 3 years later I was ready to be violated. That's what he said. That's what he actually said in the review. That's how he opened the review. And I thought, okay, all right, this guy is coming into it with an open mind. And it was just scathing. Absolutely scathing. And probably rightfully so. When Daikatana released, it was a buggy mess. And most of it had to do with the AI sidekicks. Now, you have to take into account a couple of things. This was 2000 by the point that Daikatana came out. And a couple of things had happened in the interim between them developing this game and them starting this game and releasing it. One was that the idea behind having artificial intelligence sidekicks into the game, as well as having story fully integrated into your gameplay, was not new. Quake 2 had already come out a couple of, in like late 97. So you could have a very nice cohesive, the graphics had been seen before. The graphics had been surpassed. I mean, for God's sakes, Quake 3 had come out by that point. Quake 3 Arena, I mean. And that probably had considered to be the best graphics. I mean, Unreal had already come out. But I think that the one that everybody would have argued would probably have been the big thing to basically take the wind out of Daikatana sales, which just came out of nowhere, was Half-Life. Half-Life had come out. And Half-Life allowed you to have AI sidekicks. Typically, they wouldn't last very long, but you weren't exactly penalized or forced to keep them alive, basically. Daikatana was basically one long, what's the word I'm looking for? Protect this. Protect, and everyone hates the protect, the protect the person mission. Everyone. Why? Because they would never be able to, they would have no personal ability to keep themselves alive, basically. If you ask me, it probably wouldn't be until around 2006 or so when they finally perfected how you could have that when Half-Life 2 Episode 1 came out. I could think of some times where it would, where there were some good points out there, like Elite Force, the original Star Trek Elite Force, could do Protect quests. I can't remember if Daikatana came out first before Elite Force, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, the point is that you could survive. People didn't like this, and here's the thing. You ever see these games where even older titles where it's like these guys, you bump into them and they have a sound clip and it would be annoying because you'd constantly have to bump into them because they're always in your way. And you'd always have to hear them, a sound clip, a sound effect. Well, that's one of the problems that Daikatana had. The characters were not likable. People did not like the characters. The story was there, but it was not interesting. I kind of like the varied art style, if I may. I mean, I think that they did a pretty good job with it. But the problem was that you really couldn't do much with the art style, with the technology that they were doing. The Quake 2 engine was not really designed for that kind of heavy work. It wasn't. And because of that, the graphics, the environments didn't look as well as they could have. And that was probably a limitation of the software. Had they stuck with the Quake engine, would it have been a better game? I don't know. I don't think anybody can make that decision. I never saw any of the original Quake screenshots. So the game also had a Nintendo 64 version ported over by a company called, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Kemco, who I remember fondly, and I say fondly in quotation marks, for the game Batman Dark Tomorrow, but that of course came later. The N64 version was a pretty hasty port from what I was told. I've seen footage of people trying, and I say trying with extreme quotes, is also, my gosh, everything I have to say about this version of the game is in quotes. There were a couple of things that they did. They took out the sidekicks entirely, mostly because they couldn't make the sidekicks work. They didn't work, they barely worked on the release version, the PC version anyway, and they were not exactly much of a benefit, so they were just cut completely from the Nintendo 64 version. However, that didn't exactly make for a better game. The problems that I've seen with this, not just the fact that there was a graphical downgrade, there could be no audio files really, so even though the cutscenes were in there, they were, they were made even worse because there was no audio voice acting. And also, they were very sluggish and choppy, whereas on the PC version, at least the PC version, they were much smoother, basically. As well as the fact that the control buttons didn't map very well to the Nintendo 64 controller. Now, you could say, well, that was always really a problem with the Nintendo 64 controller because it only had one analog. It couldn't really handle a first-person shooter game, at least not one as like as complex as a PC-type version as well. But there have been games that have made the Nintendo 64 version work. GoldenEye, Perfect Dark. I mean, there have been companies out there that have made it work. And, Kemco just did not do that. And, you had to push several buttons of which you really had to go digging through manuals for, or look at an online FAQ, which may not have been a possibility back then, for simply how to crouch. Even in even in console games nowadays, they'll have a prompt for push A to jump, or push this to crouch, or something. This is it was, whether it be games back then or games now, you could, there were prompts. There was no reason why the game didn't provide a prompt on the first crouch. So, anyways, from what I was told, the game was originally rental only on Blockbuster. You could probably find copies of it pretty much anywhere now. After, I think it might have been released for wide appeal. Or more likely, and I think this is what happened when Blockbuster started going under, basically, they just realized, okay, we can't rent this piece of crap anymore. Let's just sell our stock off. And I think it was probably sold under the fact that, well, we've got these copies nobody wants to rent. Let's just sell them now. And I think that's basically what happened with it. I mean, it's not, There was also, from what I was told, the Game Boy Color version that was never released in the United States, probably because... the idea behind Daikatana was just so badly received that the property was basically just poison here in the States, so they never released it here. I did hear it was released in Europe, but I haven't really heard too much about it. So now you're probably going to ask me, well, after all of this discussion about the game, have I played it? And you guys know, if you've listened to some of my previous podcasts, I don't typically like talking about games in this podcast or game franchises unless I've basically not only played them, but in most cases beaten them. There were a few exceptions for really large franchises that had lots of titles. But for the most part, I've tried to keep, unless I've played a game, I don't typically like to do a podcast. And let me tell you, I've played this game. I've played Daikatana, no cheats, start to finish, end to end, one to the other. Now, you're probably asking yourself, if I saw these bad reviews and I heard all this bad word of mouth, why the hell would I go out and buy a copy of Daikatana? And I didn't pirate it, because I don't believe in that sort of thing. So, if I didn't buy it, and I didn't pirate it, was it a gift? Well, technically, yeah, it was, actually. Back when GameSpy ruled the world, there was a Planet site for basically everything. The first Planet site I can remember in existence is Planet Quake. There were other Planet sites that were in existence around that time as well. There was a Planet Doom. There was a Planet Unreal. There was a Planet Half-Life. And I used to write... I actually used to write for some of these Planet sites later on. This actually already started my career, was writing for these Planet sites. Anyway, so there actually was a Planet Daikatana. I am not joking. There actually was a legitimate Daikatana fan site. And I know what you're saying. Who the hell would run a Daikatana fan site? I have no idea, but somebody did. And I think it was around 2001 or so when I was daily visiting the web. Planet Daikatana was holding a contest. And on that contest, they were offering 3 prizes. The grand prize was a copy of the game signed by John Romero, as well as a very rare lithograph. And a T-shirt and some other content, stuff like this, Another was a copy of the game signed by John Romero, full license access to GameSpy software, because they ran on licenses, but at the time it was basically full licenses. You buy a license once and you'd have it forever, basically. And a T-shirt. Well, I don't know why, but I submitted my name and email address for a prize, thinking I've never really won anything. I'll probably just submit it because it couldn't hurt. One day, I think I was a sophomore. No, I was a senior. I think it was a senior. I was like either a sophomore or a senior in high school. It's not sophomore. I was a junior or senior in high school. And I had one day I was looking forward to a very long day. I had to stay after school to work on some tests, basically makeups for stuff I had missed. So I had to make up a test, and I had other stuff I had to do basically afterwards. So early in that morning, I was gearing up for a very long day. It wasn't that bad a day. Don't get me wrong. I didn't do badly on the test or anything. It was just going to be a very long day. And I was getting ready to basically just collect my thoughts because typically in the very beginning I'd be like the first person in the classroom. We had computer access. I would basically get onto a computer and I'd spend 20 minutes homeroom basically just screwing around on the internet looking up news in the morning basically. Typically I'd go on GameSpy.com. So I go on Planet Daikatana because it was just part of my web thing. Don't ask me why. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to have a long day. I look on the website, and I see my name on the website. I freaking won a copy of Daikatana signed by John Romero. And I know this right now. I just know how I'm going to edit this. So I'm sure that you've probably seen images of a Daikatana box flashing across your screen. And you're probably like, it looks like there's a part of the screen that's got something written on it. Is that really John Romero's signature? Or are these really? Yeah, that's my copy of Daikatana. Unfortunately, my mother smashed it. That was really nice. She came into my room at one point and she landed on it, so the box is smashed. Game was fine. The content inside the box was fine. It's still signed by Romero. His signature wasn't altered, but the box was smashed. Thank you, Mom, for that. Really appreciate it. And, so I actually have a copy of the game, which I got with a GameSpy t-shirt, and a full license to the GameSpy software. Now, obviously, GameSpy software, it doesn't mean squat anymore. GameSpy is now gone, defunct. But that license was good for probably going on around, 6-7 years. Gotta give them that. So you're probably asking, okay, so if you have a copy of Daikatana that you received for free, signed by John Romero, did you play it? Yeah, I was bored, and I had a system that could play it, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to see if this game was any good, because don't get me wrong, I had played the demo, so I kind of had an idea about what I was getting into. But there was something else. By this time, Daikatana's development was pretty much over. This was about a year after release. And John Romero's team had actually released patches for Daikatana 2. And these patches actually fixed a lot of the game's problems. Like, it removed the save gems. It fixed not all the problems, but a lot of the problems with the AI were fixed. In particular, there was one real issue that the AI characters were having. In particular, the fact that, at least when the game was being reviewed, I was reading several reviews of the game which basically said that typically you would have your AI sidekicks and they were so stupid they would be crushed by a closing door. Well, they fixed that. They actually fixed that. So, now, you're probably saying, well, if my AI sidekick is killed, what does that mean for the game? Game over. It would still be game over if your sidekick was killed, and you still wouldn't be able to progress if you needed to have one of your or two of your sidekicks with you. You would not be able to transition from one level map to the other. But at least they weren't being killed by their most biggest foe, probably the biggest killer since Grass. In Ultima, the door. So they fixed that. That was actually fixed. There was a couple of other things. Like I said, they removed the save gems and they fixed a bunch of other instability. The game was actually quite stable when I played it. So I booted up Daikatana, and I played it from end to end. And by the time I was my freshman in college, I had beaten it at least once. In fact, I only played through it once. But I had beaten it. And I didn't think it was that bad, actually. Granted, like I said, I did play version 1.2, which John Romero basically does say that everyone should play. You should not play the release version of the game. But still, yeah. Patches for the win. It was nothing great by any means. The story was passable. Like I said, by the time Daikatana came out, at least by the time that I had played Daikatana, I had played about a dozen games at least that were already better than that one. Jedi Knight was better. Quake 1 and 2 and 3 were better. And Quake 3 didn't even have really a single-player campaign. It was practically multiplayer only. And it was better. Unreal Tournament was better. Again, same thing with Quake 3. Half-Life. I don't know. Half-Life, I remember not really liking that much. But Half-Life was better than Daikatana. I didn't think it was like the greatest game ever made when I played it, but I still thought it was better than Daikatana, of course. Max Payne I had played by that point, and Max Payne only came out like a year later. And that was an infinitely better game. Now, what are the things that I liked? I thought the voice acting wasn't bad. I thought the character models for what they were trying to do, as well as the environments, were not bad for what they had with the Quake 2 engine. I thought the story wasn't terrible. I mean, it was certainly better than a lot of other stories that I had seen. Plot lines were a little stupid, but, it wasn't like the worst story that I ever seen. I've seen plenty of movies that had a worse plot line. And plenty of television shows that had worse plot lines. I kind of like the time travel aspect, the changing of weapons and stuff like that. I like the variety. The enemies did change. I did like the variety of enemies. I like the gore. I mean, I like the fact that they didn't tone down the violence. It did keep to Quake 2 levels of violence. A lot of games nowadays are kind of toning, we're at a time we're kind of starting to tone down the violence. I like that they kept the violence intact. Kind of novel. So, and I like the length. It wasn't like, there were some levels that were really frustrating. Like there was one or two levels, particularly in the third episode, like the third area, the snow levels, where it was basically where Miko got sick and Superfly had a carrier, which basically meant that Superfly couldn't do squat, nor could Miko. They couldn't defend you, and yet you had to keep them alive. But ironically enough, at least for version 1.2, I know a lot of people said it was pretty terrible, but it wasn't that tough to keep them alive when they weren't doing anything. So, I don't know. So, I like the environments. I like the weapons, I guess. The storyline was fine. But again, like I said, I never played version 1 and I never played version 1.1. So I can't tell you exactly how bad the original versions were. I have heard stories about it crashing a lot, being unstable. Yes, it was still annoying to be walking into the characters. Yes, it was still annoying to see them walking into walls trying to follow you. But at the very least, you'd have to direct them everywhere, basically. Yes, it was annoying trying to have to constantly let them use health or give them health when in fact you needed health too. But they couldn't protect themselves. They had health bars, but they were decent in a fight. At least when it came down to a firefight, where there was a room full of enemies, they would they would at least assist with taking out the enemies. They weren't useless. So I got to give them that. They could fight. I mean, they weren't they weren't godly, but they did work. Multiplayer environments weren't bad. I can't remember really anybody on the game's multiplayer except for the Unknown Camera Person. I know the Unknown Camera Person, actually. I think I played a round or two against them. After I got my copy for free, they actually just like, I don't know if it was a sadomasochism thing or whatever. It's like, I gotta play this game now. I gotta pick up a copy. Saw a copy for like $20 in the store and bought it just so that they could play me in multiplayer and we could play and see how bad it was. And actually, they liked it too. They liked Daikatana too, or at least I don't know if they still liked it, but I specifically remember reading something that they had written down. It might have been as a joke, but I clearly remember these exact words. I'll admit it, I like Daikatana. That's what the unknown camera person once said. True story. Again, they might have been sarcastic about it, but I really hadn't heard too many complaints out of them, and they also completed the game. So, was it worth the development time? Probably not. They probably could have. Just released, finished up the Quake levels. What are lessons that could be learned from this? I kind of want to talk a little bit about the future of the property, but I kind of also want to talk. For some reason, I kind of want to bring up lessons learned on this one. And the clearest lesson that can be learned was that while you can be a great designer, it doesn't mean you're a very good manager of people. And from what I read in Masters of Doom, the problem was management. That was the major problem at Iron Storm. The game's development did take a while because they had a lot of stuff, but in a lot of cases, because it was basically one man's vision, and one man was basically dealing everything, the problem was that a lot of people were basically developing stuff or wasting time developing stuff, no slam on them, that ended up basically unusable. Guys would work really hard on getting levels together, and they would just be, they wouldn't work. The levels just could not ship. So you waste all this time basically developing levels that you can't ship with, basically. So it is basically a lesson in time management. It's a lesson in management in general, basically. Now, but there were some good things that came out of Daikatana's development. First off is that the publishers became much more protective with their money. And you never really saw, other than the one other studio that could basically afford to waste time, you never really saw super long development times in titles, really. At least not like that. There were other games that took a while to do, but they still got released within, I would say, reasonable amount of time for what they were trying to work on. And like Alan Wake took 5 years, basically, at least. And when they released Alan Wake, that game was polished to hell. I don't think it ever even needed a single patch. And I'm talking about the Xbox version. I think the PC version might have needed to get patched once or twice. But the Xbox version, which was the primary development platform for that game when it was released, was practically perfect. No slowdowns, really. No bugs, no crashes. That game was basically perfect. Very, very good game. So, there was that. Another thing is, of course, if it wasn't for Daikatana, we never would have had Deus Ex. Because if it wasn't for Ion Storm, basically getting the leeway they could with a publisher, Warren Spector never would have made that game. And so, and he never would have had the freedom to make the game that he wanted to make, basically. And John Romero ensured that Warren Spector would make the game that he wanted. In fact, that was his first guidelines. Make whatever you want. Make it exactly as you want to make it. Because he knew that Warren was talented, and he would make a great game. And we never would have gotten the Deus Ex franchise. I stand by that. I don't think we would have gotten the Deus Ex franchise without Daikatana. And there was another game we wouldn't have gotten without Daikatana, which I absolutely loved. It was the second game to come out of Ion Storm Dallas. It was actually the game to finish Ion Storm Dallas's reputation. Unfortunately, I'm going to say this with a very heavy heart, the game was doomed. And it just so happened that it was still a great freaking game. But whether it was great or not great, whether it sold or didn't sell, it wasn't going to save Ion Storm Dallas. Nothing was going to save Ion Storm Dallas. Because of the failure of Daikatana, nothing would have saved Ion Storm Dallas. And that was, of course, Anachronox, which is another game that I used to write about quite a bit. Later on, when I joined up on the Planet sites, that was like one of the first games I ever wrote about professionally. Yep, true story. And I love that game, even to this day. And the funny thing is that there was a lot of parallels, at least technologically, between Anachronox and Daikatana. Both games used the Quake 2 engine. Both games were developed by Ironstorm Dallas. They were two very different type of games, of course. They were also directed by two different guys, and John Romero did Daikatana. Tom Hall, the great Tom Hall, did Anachronox. But they were still developed on the same studio. There were still people that worked on both projects, I'm sure. Pretty much after Daikatana, pretty much most development probably shifted to Anachronox. There were a couple of people on the Daikatana team that shifted over to another stuff, which I'll talk about in a bit when I'm talking about the future. But I'm sure that a lot of the Dallas team that stayed around probably worked on Anachronox, or at least assisted in Anachronox in some way. And I'm grateful for that, because Anachronox was a great game that I absolutely love. It basically solved a lot of the problems that Daikatana had. The game had full lip syncing, which Daikatana did not have during cutscenes. Great voiceover work. Great art style. It wasn't 100% stable. I have to admit that. They couldn't ensure stability on that one. It was one of the first PC games that I can remember that had a day one patch. But and on top of that, there was one of the developers that stuck around and basically fixed it on, about maybe 2 or 3 years later, he released a patch that fixed like 99% of the game's problems. I remember I was having a really nasty bug with it. It was crashing on random loads. But the patch actually fixed it. Thank you, Joey, for that one. One of the developers named Joey actually fixed the game on his downtime. So there was that. So if it wasn't for Daikatana, we wouldn't have gotten Anachronox either, which is another great title that I love. Maybe I'll in the future do an Anachronox podcast. I don't know. So, what can I say about the future of Daikatana? Well, like I was hinting about throughout some of this podcast, I know that after Daikatana's development ceased, Ironstorm Dallas was working on a secret project, basically, that was probably being headed by Romero. I think they were calling it Game X. Stevie Case was working on it, and the reason why I know that Game X exists and Stevie Case was working on it was because PC Gamer actually did their second Game Gods article about the next generation of Game Gods, which focused on the younger generation of game developers, and several developers that they were imagining would be the next big things in video game development. Cliff Bleszinski was on that list. American McGee was on that list. So some of the people did end up. This was American McGee. He was still working on Alice. He hadn't released Alice yet. Cliff Bleszinski had made his name on Unreal, but this was pre-Gears of War. But what you could basically say is this. We don't know really anything about what Game X was. If it was a Daikatana sequel or not. We just don't know. No, I don't think... I went looking through John Romero's web archives the other day, trying to do some research for this podcast to see if he ever spilled the beans on it. And I don't really remember... I was digging through some of his archives, and I didn't find anything where he talked about that game. Like I said earlier in the podcast, Daikatana 2 was licensed. They were talking about developing it. It was going to be done by Human Head Studios, and it was going to use the Unreal Engine. Obviously, it was never released. I know that Human Head worked on it at least a little bit. But when the project got canceled due to delays with Daikatana, Human Head basically took the experience working with the Unreal Engine, and they made a game called Rune instead. And then later on, they went on to make Prey, which is another game, which is a game I really did like, using the Doom 3 engine. But that's another story entirely. Maybe I'll do a Prey podcast. You never know. So, what is the future? Basically after Ironstorm Dallas did shut down, Tom Hall, John Romero, Stevie Case, all kind of left to basically go do their own thing. They formed a game called Monkey Stone. They formed a small game studio called Monkey Stone, basically, which had a small but, I think admirable goal, and that was to basically release games for the Pocket PC. Now, I know what you're probably asking yourself. Game studios like this are a dime a dozen nowadays, because everybody's basically developing for smartphones. Yeah, everybody's developing for smartphones now. The thing is that Pocket PCs at around 2002, while they existed, many of them were using a Windows derivative operating system called Windows CE. They were very expensive. Very expensive. They were not only they were kind of bloated. The technology was not really there yet, nor was the design really there for a decent operating system on them. So basically, the power, nobody really had these things. Monkey Stone was basically trying to develop for a market that was still about at least 5 or 6 years off. I think they were just too new. They made one title that I can think of off the top of my head that did end up getting ported to the PC called Hyperspace Delivery Boy. To this day, I am still kicking myself for not buying that game. I wish I could have played that game. I really do. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why that game is still not available for download or purchase. Monkeystone.com, our Monkey-Stone Games website, still exists, but it only has a picture of the site logo. I know that, shortly after Monkey-Stone released Hyperspace Delivery Boy, Tom and John basically had to go get day jobs and stuff, and they started finding work at Midway and stuff. Basically doing, day jobs, and Monkey-Stone was like something else that they were doing. But, I mean, why not continue to sell the games that you worked on? Does Hyperspace Delivery Boy not play on modern PCs anymore? I guess if it doesn't, that's one thing, but I really would have loved to have played it. I really would have. It'd be interesting to see John Romero. John, if you're listening to this podcast, I love you. Please consider releasing Hyperspace Delivery as like freeware on your website, or like, make it available. I really would have loved to have played it. It would look like it was heavily inspired by like sci-fi adventure games or crazy science fiction adventure. It was silly. It was probably inspired by Futurama, I would say. The whole concept behind a hyperspace delivery boy would probably be very common to anybody who would remember Fry's character from Futurama. So there was that. Maybe that's why maybe they were concerned about legal ramifications from, Fox, 30th Century Fox or something. I don't know. But that's like my, if I had a major regret about games that I missed out on, Hyperspace Delivery Boy would probably be one of them. So there's that. So I've listened to me ramble on for about an hour about this probably overlooked game. I'm not trying to convince anybody to play it. For the love of God, don't even bother on the Nintendo 64 version. I did hear that as of the time of this writing, it was actually it's on Steam. You can like download it and purchase and download it on Steam if you really want to play it. It is available on Steam. In fact, the Unknown Camera person actually told me that because the game was less than $2, they actually bought it on Steam. So just so you know, that actually was the inspiration for me doing this podcast. It's like, yo, it's $2. I gotta get it. I can't resist it at $2 on Steam. You should talk about the game on your website. All right, here you go. This one's for you. So there you have it, guys. That's my thoughts on Daikatana. I want to thank you guys for listening. It's an overlooked game that I think a lot of lessons can be learned of from the video game industry. I don't think people ever really stop talking about it. It's always considered to be the game that you talk about in hushed tones, almost making like it's synonymous with failure or something. When in fact, I think it wasn't just a failure that was outright to be a failure. It's almost fascinating. I could imagine that if you were a person that was interested in possibly telling a story about business, or just like doing a business class or something like that, like lecturing a business class, and you would talk about real world applications for business stories. The Daikatana story would be a great story, almost like a watch out for this, story to basically tell your classmates. I'd love to lecture that. I'd love to be able to come in as a guest lecturer and say, yeah, don't do this. This is what this guy did. Don't do this. And I'm sure there's other business stories you could tell about that sort of thing that would be cool, nerdy. You could talk about the time that Al Michaels was traded for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. That is a true story. I am not kidding about it. Or Duke Nukem Forever. You know, it's just going to be one of those stories that probably people in the tech industry are going to probably continue to talk about forever. And I'm happy to basically give my contribution about it, as well as my conclusions. I'd like to thank you guys for listening. I'd like for you to post a comment. I do have other podcasts in the pipeline that I am considering. The last podcast I can remember that I can probably work on would be a Commander Keen podcast that was recommended to me a couple of months ago. I could be able to do that, but it's not currently in the pipeline, at least not for the next podcast. Other podcasts that are being considered for the future include No One Lives Forever. They oft overlooked franchise from Monolith, and Prey. Actually, I am thinking about doing a Prey podcast. So please post a comment on what you think about that, or any further ideas that you have. I listen to you guys. I want to hear your comments about future videos because you guys inspire me to do videos that I wouldn't normally do. So please keep those comments coming. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, guys, this is Maniac with GameAccess.net. Over and out.